Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Sego. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us save our peoples and the planet. And welcome back to the second video in my series on combating racism in Canada. Today's video is on one of the most damaging forms of racism in Canada: pipelines. Yes, you heard me right. Combating racism against Indigenous peoples in Canada requires stopping pipeline projects on Indigenous lands. Not quite sure how it relates to racism? Well, stay tuned to hear more. Want to get at the heart of racism in Canada? Well, we're going to have a hard conversation about pipelines. Yes, that's right, pipelines. Pipelines and other extractive industries operate at the very core of racism against Indigenous peoples in Canada. Settler governments, transnational corporations, and some segments of society have long treated Indigenous peoples and our lands as though we are exploitable resources to be commodified, traded, and sold to the highest bidder. This might sound harsh, but it is the very lived reality of Indigenous peoples. The exploitation of our lands and peoples has been allowed to continue because of the very deeply embedded racist ideology that we are less worthy and less human than other peoples. You hear it every time someone places the need for jobs over the lives and lands of Indigenous peoples. You might remember our first video in the series that races were constructed by white people, specifically those in power, to suit their legal, political, economic, and social interests. And the arbitrary characteristics assigned to different races serve to reinforce white superiority and racial inferiority, often for economic gain. Canada as a country was built on a foundation of white superiority that privileged and empowered white people and punished and oppressed racialized people like Black and Indigenous peoples. Black peoples were used as slave labor to develop and extract resources from stolen Indigenous lands. On both accounts, race was used to justify the economic enrichment of white peoples and their governments and to downplay the devastating harms to us that resulted. Pipelines destroy the lands and ecosystems on which they sit. They disrupt the habitats of birds, fish, and animals that rely on those lands, and they also cause significant damage to wetlands and water systems when they leak. And yes, all pipelines leak. In addition to the theft of resources from Indigenous lands and relegating local Indigenous peoples to mostly temporary labor jobs, the construction of these pipelines bring large man camps into Indigenous territories, increasing the risks of violence, exploitation, disappearances, and murders of Indigenous women and girls. But this isn't news. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of historic and ongoing genocide that is based on both racism and sexism, part of which relates to the sexualized violence of Indigenous women and girls near man camps. Racism against Indigenous peoples violates Indigenous laws, Canadian laws, and international laws, and that includes all of the human rights treaties that Canada has ratified at the international level. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, often referred to as UN CERD, is a body of independent human rights experts that monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination by countries all over the world. The convention came into force in 1969 and was ratified by Canada in 1970. This convention not only condemns any form of racial discrimination, but it also specifically condemns systems that are based on white superiority. This convention specifically condemns white superiority and says that any doctrine of superiority that's based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory or in practice anywhere. And some of the rights contained in the convention include the right to equal treatment in justice systems, freedom from state violence and bodily harm, and it should be also noted that UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also incorporated the human rights from all of these UN treaty bodies as well. UNDRIP also recognizes that we're the rightful owners of our land, that no development can happen without free, prior, and informed consent, and that we are protected from the forced removal of our lands. Now, I bring up UN CERD because they have a process known as the Early Warning and Urgent Action Procedure, wherein the committee can consider information and reach out to countries with a view to preventing racial discrimination. In December of 2019, the committee met in Geneva and considered the situation of 3 major development projects: the Site C Dam, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Coastal Gaslink Pipeline. In their review of these projects, UN CERD outlined several major concerns that they had. One, that Canada did not get free, prior, and informed consent from all Indigenous groups who would be impacted by these projects. 2, that these large-scale projects have the capacity to cause irreparable harm to Indigenous peoples, our rights, cultures, lands, and way of life. That there were ongoing forced removals, disproportionate use of force, harassment, and intimidation by law enforcement against peaceful Indigenous land defenders. And number 4, that there was escalating threats of violence against Indigenous peoples. After considering all of the evidence and the laws in relation to preventing racial discrimination, UN CERD called on Canada to immediately halt all construction and suspend all permits for the Site C Dam, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Coastal Gaslink Pipeline. They also urged Canada to freeze all present and future approvals of large-scale development projects impacting Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. The committee further went on to urge Canada to immediately cease the forced evictions of the Secwepmec peoples and the Wet'suwet'en peoples from their territories, and for the RCMP and any security forces to immediately leave their traditional lands. Equally as important is that they also urge Canada to specifically prohibit the use of lethal weapons against Indigenous peoples, especially by the RCMP. Now keep in mind, this is the UN committee that is specifically tasked with monitoring human rights in relation to racial discrimination. These development projects, proceeding without the consent of all impacted Indigenous peoples, is racial discrimination, and that discrimination will cause irreparable harm to Indigenous lands and bodies. In proceeding with these projects, and in fact buying the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Canada has knowingly engaged in racial discrimination against Indigenous peoples for economic gain. Had Canada acted according to its own rule of law, it would have halted these projects and withdrawn the RCMP from our territories. But Canada decided to act outside the law, and in so doing not only violated its own laws, but international laws to which it's agreed to be bound. This is a very clear indication that Canada still operates under this racist ideology, that the destruction of Indigenous lands and the corresponding harm that comes to Indigenous peoples are justifiable, so long as it economically benefits non-Indigenous peoples. In other words, so long as it creates jobs for Canadians and dividends for corporate shareholders. If we are to truly combat racism in Canada, we have to root it out in all of its forms at the individual and systemic level. We cannot allow Canada to gaslight racial discrimination anymore. It's not good enough to say that some Indigenous peoples approve pipelines or that it will create jobs. The legal standard is free, prior and informed consent of all impacted Indigenous peoples, and decision-making will be done according to our laws and traditions, not the decision-making bodies that Canada decides. No one said combating racism in Canada would be easy. If we are to truly root it out, we have to stop pipelines in their tracks. Thank you all for watching my channel. I really hope that you join me on this action plan to end racism in Canada. And I'll post links to the UN CERD decision as well as the Convention Against Racial Discrimination in the description box below. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing, commenting, and sharing these videos with your family, friends, colleagues, and social justice allies. And if you want additional resources, you can check out my website at www.pampalmater.com. Thank you all for your continued support and your ongoing feedback. I hope you join me in the next video in my Combating Racism in Canada series. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.